2,000 miles of open ocean from the nearest continent, eroded down by time and the elements, the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands emerge and subside across 1,200 miles of the Pacific Ocean. Harboring the healthiest coral reef ecosystem in the world, here predators dominate the food chain, and colorful marine life fills every crevice in the reef. The Hawaiian Islands arise much like generations from the sea, the youngest and largest island of Hawaii still forming with currently active volcanoes. As the shifting continental plate beneath the sea moved across a hot spot of volcanic activity, islands, pinnacles, seamounts, banks, atolls, and reefs emerged from a deep ocean in a northwesterly direction. Like stepping stones in time, this archipelago provides a manual to the birth and evolution of an atoll ecosystem. West-northwest of Kauai, Nihoa Island formed 7 million years ago and is the first in the chain known as the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Northwest of Nihoa, from youngest to oldest, we find Moku Manamana, French frigate shoals, Gardner pinnacles, Morrow Reef, Laysan Island, Lisiansky Island, Pearl and Hermes Atoll, Midway Atoll, and Curie Atoll. Hawaiian oral tradition details ancestral voyages to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands in double-hulled canoes, where navigation and fishing were practiced and taught to new generations. Archaeological research has documented that Native Hawaiians once lived on Nihoa Island, and religious shrines on Moku Manamana testify that Hawaiians lived and worshipped for centuries in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. More than 7,000 marine species are supported by this underwater landscape, with new species being described from each scientific voyage to the area. The majority of highly endangered Hawaiian monk seals and threatened green sea turtles depend on the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands for breeding and foraging. More than 14 million Pacific seabirds nest on the small emergent islands here. Once devastated by guano and feather harvesters, the story of protection for these islands begins nearly 100 years ago with President Teddy Roosevelt. In 1909, Roosevelt established the Hawaiian Islands Bird Reservation. Most recently, on June 15, 2006, President Bush signed a proclamation to designate nearly 140,000 square miles as the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Marine National Monument.
Marine life is so important to Hawaii. It's what makes us distinct. One of the many things, but one of the most important things.
The Hawaiian Islands have the highest proportion of marine endemic species. Those are species that are found nowhere else on Earth except the Hawaiian Islands. And therefore, it represents a global biodiversity hotspot. We find in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands that over 50% of all the individual fish that we see on the reefs up there are found nowhere else on Earth. So if half the fish are found nowhere else and they're depleted or eliminated, that can never be replaced.
Perfect white sand beaches with no humans around, hundreds of thousands of birds and turtles that ignored you. They weren't afraid of any human presence. They just ignored you. You were an obstacle to their sunning themselves on the beach.
the lagoon was this marvelous turquoise color, and it was reflecting off the clouds. So you get off and you look up and the clouds are turquoise. And everywhere were birds. It was the albatross breeding season, and so there were just every foot and a half was a bird clacking and honking and carrying on.
Countless species of birds not being afraid of humans, you know, actually pecking at your feet saying, what are you doing invading my space? Beautiful, tranquil lagoons filled with fish of large size. Nenui, just schools and schools of nenui and kala. You know, kala so thick and so healthy that they almost looked obese. And that was an impression that I got.
There's all these large sharks and jacks, and everything kind of seems in its place. All the animals are interacting. All the holes in the reef are filled with animals trying to stay away from getting eaten. There's monk seals cruising by with jacks following the monk seals that are, you know, and they're co-adapted to feeding strategies together.
Dolphins playing in the lagoon at Midway, having no cares in the world.
It's a place that's just awe-inspiring, and a place that when you get up there and you get in the water, you realize that it's different than anything that you've ever seen before. There's large predators in abundance. You don't see invasive algae, alien algae species like you see in the main Hawaiian Islands. You see a unique coral assemblage up there. Everything kind of is in its place and functioning in a synergy that you just don't see in other coral reefs or other ecosystems around the world for that matter. So it's really important that we look at this as a heritage that we're going to provide for future generations.
The Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are very special from many perspectives. From a cultural perspective, they represent the older ancestor islands. So from that perspective, you get a sense of cultural history. In addition to that, you have two islands, Nihoa and Mokumanumana, which have many, in fact, significantly higher numbers of religious structures on both of them, and burials, and that indicates that the sacredness of those two islands, which just happen to be closest to the main Hawaiian Islands. With regards to cultural history in these Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, I've had at least one kupuna, Uncle Eddie Ka'anana, refer to an interpretation of Mokumanumana, not as a specific place, but as the visual representations of fingers, as a descriptor, that these are finger islets or islands that are branch off from the main Hawaiian Islands. He has also indicated to us, as well as several other kupuna, who remember as young men their uncles preparing for trips to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, possibly as far as French frigate shoals. And the preparation would occur like this. From Ni'ihau, the canoes would get ready. they would sail to Kauai, where supplies would be gathered, preparations made for the right weather, the right time, and then the vessels would leave from Kauai to head north, where they would spend several weeks surviving, catching resources, providing resources, preparing these resources to bring them home for sharing with family members. There were no problem with the resources around Kauai or Niihau or any other islands. At that time, resources were fine. It was more effective. The status of the resource probably looked like the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands at that time. So why would they go 300, 400, 500 miles to capture other resources and bring them home? Well, number one, Hawaiians believe that the ike, or the understanding, comes not from the talking but from the doing. So the ike, the training that these folks went through, that these Hawaiians went through, to sail up there and sail back, is the teaching and the learning. Resources from certain areas have additional mana, if you will. Okay? So the fact that they sailed to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, did what they needed to accomplish, and then brought back resources to share, closing the circle on that was the sharing of those resources from Nihoa, Moku Manamana, French frigate, with the family members, because it came from a more special place, and therefore when it was brought back to share, that specialness was shared. The fact that we don't have physical evidence of Hawaiians, other than in the earliest recordings in ship's logs of Hawaiians, it's either by Captain Cook or Vancouver, of Hawaiians up in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands gathering, probably is not a good indicator of when Hawaiians started to go up there. The recent trip by Hokulea is a much more good indicator of the fact that if at that time in the 1100s, 900 AD, they could sail from Tahiti to Hawaii, they certainly could sail from Hawaii north and back. So just because there's no physical evidence remaining and there's no written accounts of it, is not a good indication that it didn't occur. The likelihood that it occurred is much higher based on oral histories, and then later the recording by Western captains who observed them not only preparing to go, but actually in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands.
I think it's really important that we afford these Northwestern Hawaiian Islands as much protection as we possibly can. I think some of the Hawaiian people have been calling them the Kupuna Islands, the Elder Islands. And I think that's so right because we can learn so much. First of all, they've been so lightly fished that we're seeing, particularly in the fish populations, a completely different ecosystem. It's predator dominated. 54% of the fish up there are huge, are sharks, schools of sharks, and big jacks. And the rest of the population is very diverse. There's probably 3 times more fish in those islands than there are on the main Hawaiian Islands. And the ones that we have that are the same, they're much bigger in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So it's kind of a chance to see how our islands probably looked in the past.
While at Midway, I got to experience a life-changing event for me in that I had always heard from kupuna in the main Hawaiian Islands that a kuli grew to 4 pounds. So, you know, I'm used to seeing maybe a kuli that size that's approaching a pound. That, to me, that was the measure of how big a kuli got in my lifetime. But kupuna would tell me that when they were growing up, well, yeah, the biggest kuli that they saw were about 4 pounds. Okay. So I was diving in the lagoon by myself, just kind of checking things out, snorkeling, and a big shadow approached me from the side, and I thought immediately, uh-oh, there's a big tiger shark there. But as the shadow became much clearer to me underwater, it was a school of akuli, large akuli, largest than I've ever imagined. So the stories that the kupuna would share with me, I actually got to see the same fish that they got to see. And that changed my way of thinking about fisheries management and how far we've come from what our kupuna have seen to what we now consider what is big. And another example is mullet. You know, we see a mullet today in the main Hawaiian Islands that approaches 18 inches, and we think, God, that's a huge mullet. Well, when you go back into the literature and you talk to the old timers, they'll tell you that mullet 36 inches long was something that the fishermen back then would consider a significant sight. So there is some truth to this theory of the sliding scale, that we are a product of our experiences, and what we see as large today becomes acceptable when we measure that against what was acceptable to our kupuna, our ancestors. We find that maybe it shouldn't be acceptable, that we need to be doing a better job of managing the resource so that we have 4-pound akuli and 36-inch mullet swimming around once again for our children and grandchildren to see.
So when you look at fish populations up there, even though 54% of the fish are big top carnivores, sharks and jacks, there are still many more herbivores and lower level carnivores than anywhere else, particularly on the main islands. A good example is the uhu uliuli, the spectacled parrotfish. It's endemic, found only in Hawaii, and you rarely see them in Hawaii. The only place I've ever seen a male is on Oahu, is in Hanauma Bay, that marine protected area. But apparently up in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, there are 700% more uhu of that species. And that's simply because of its isolation and it hasn't been fished. Down here, people tend to want to get the biggest fish they can catch. And in the case of the parrotfish, that they take out the big male. They move in harems. So without the big male, there's no fertilizing the eggs of the females.
It really opens your eyes to what an impact we've had on coral reef systems around the world, and how, you know, how dramatically we've altered them through mankind. The Northwest Hawaiian Islands probably represents what the main Hawaiian Islands looked like several hundred years ago before all the impacts through overfishing and shoreline development, loss of nursery habitats, filling in of estuaries. All these things have contributed to the decline in the coral reefs and the coral reef fisheries in the main Hawaiian Islands. We just don't see large jacks or sharks anymore in the main Hawaiian Islands. Many of the reefs are overgrown with alien algae because of the lack of herbivorous fishes.
Our fish today are down 75 to 80% of what they were in the main Hawaiian Islands, what they were 100 years ago. And so I think it's, for that reason, so critical to protect the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands so we can see what we could be. We may never reach that goal again. Some of our fish populations may never recover.
Currently, the most, I guess, conflicting issue with regards to strong management for the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands is how do you resolve the bottom fisherman issue in any new management scheme. And it is generally recognized that there aren't that many bottom fishermen that are actually fishing. There are a number of permits that are currently issued, but very few of them actually being fished. I believe there's less than about 8 people that actually are fishing their permits for one reason or another. In the current fisheries management regime that's being proposed by the sanctuary, there is the idea of allowing the current bottom fishers to continue fishing for a period of time, and to also include the option of a buyout. So that's encouraging. And I think any success at getting either a sanctuary designated or a refuge designated is going to have to include that sort of philosophy. So that's very important.
Yes, there are a handful of fishermen that do up there some deep sea fishing, but the facts are that little of those fish end up on the tables of Hawaiian restaurants. Most of the Hawaiian restaurant fish come from other sources that can get the fish here quicker and fresher.
Because there's very, very little human use up in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands today. There's very, very little commercial fishing. There are some current permittees that have current permits in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands and are fishing in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, about 9 permittees right now. It would be relatively easy, and they have a very relatively minor part of the overall fishery that's associated with the state of Hawaii. It would be very, very easy to treat those permittees fairly, to compensate them fairly for the retirement of their permits and the equipment that they bought in reliance on those permits. It would be a relatively easy matter to phase those permits out and say no more permits, no more extractive use in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands.
My first impression was, this beautiful place is nirvana, it's forever. I found a place to work and fish in peace because no one was there, and there was no competition, so this would be a wonderful place. But I know I was wrong. I had the wrong impression. But at a young age of 20, well, the world was, I was here, the world was here, this is the oyster. But it didn't last. It was not sustainable.
What were some of the species that you saw there upon your arrival and got your heart beating fast as a fisherman?
Yeah, I saw some things there that I will never see again, I don't expect, and that was huge anai mullet, huge boy, never saw before. Never had the chance in the main islands here to grow to that size, but these were the large, mature reproducers. And because I think in each spawn, only a few of the species survived to add to that standing stock that when you arrive there, you see that, but it's taken years for that to build up. And in just a short time, you can take it. So you've taken the main reproducing stock. And in the case of, let's say, lobsters, it takes 7 years from the time it will hatch from an egg, grow to reproduce. 7 years. A lot of fish species have almost the same life cycle. It's 5 years, maybe even a little over 5 years. Lobsters, 7 years. You take that standing stock, can you imagine the years that intervene for that animal could have reproduced to recover? If you just figure that out, you can realize you can damage a species very quickly. And that's what we all got to understand. And it's not a matter of just going and taking it. And, don't worry about the future, because it's not going to be there when you go back.
But that's a lesson that you shared with me. You had to learn the hard way. Yeah?
I learned the hard way, and it was very expensive. I fished the whole island chain, and today when I look back, it's like this. If I went to a place that I hadn't been before, but I can tell the less configuration of the land, the bottom of the beach or the bay, and I can see the sand and the Oahu. I can almost tell that there's going to be some fish there if I see a discoloration. I can tell, and I will work there. But when I come back there in another month or so, there won't be anything there. And that happened to me when I went down to the Northwestern Islands. I found fish that was there like maybe constant, and I would catch it, but when I would come back, there wouldn't be any. I was thinking, why am I here? It's so discouraging. I know I can't do it. So in the end, I just turned the key to start my little donkey engine, kicked the clutch in, turned over the big diesel, fired up, went out the reef and looked to Honolulu, and I did not look back, and I did not go back. That was the end for me, because it would not work. What I was doing, what I was catching, was going downhill. So the two places is the same, except that that one out there, in balance as it is now, with the predator-prey working together, the human element like myself intervening was not a benefit. Besides, it was not profitable. It was only temporary. It was an idea. It looked okay, but it didn't work. And I would like to just say that anybody who's thinking about it, I would say, don't try to do it. It's very difficult, and it's very expensive. And maybe in the end, if you're looking at a balance sheet, it's not worth it. That's my advice. In the meantime, we can learn from that kind of an experience that everything has a value in the ocean, and we should be protecting. The malama, take care. That little kuleana that's yours here, take care. You can get so much from it, but you cannot take the resource. That's the lesson that I would say I would like to leave to anybody, and especially people that would like to know.
For all these reasons, we see a system that's kind of intact and in balance to the greatest degree possible, much more so than we see on any other systems around the planet. So really, I just think it's all of our responsibility to be the stewards of this place, because all the other coral reefs that we've looked at around the world have been so impacted, we'll probably never get back to what they used to look like.
With regards to one of the previously harvested stocks in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, the spiny lobster and slipper lobster, the history of the management of lobsters in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands by the Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council is a classic study for future marine managers of how not to manage a resource. You don't, as the stocks decline, you don't switch from spinies to slippers and keep them both in the same model, because they're different species. But in keeping them on the same model, what you do is you maintain that catch per unit effort so that it looks like the fishery is doing fine. Ultimately, when you start impacting the slipper lobsters after you've impacted the spiny lobsters, you don't go ahead and propose and then adopt rules to allow for the taking of females with eggs, buried females, and undersized lobsters based on some assumption that it makes no sense to throw them back overboard because the predators are going to get them and you're going to lose them anyway. That is such a classic example of how to not manage a fishery. So the science appeared to have been fabricated for whatever the industry wanted. The fisheries management plans, the FMPAs, also appeared to be also evolved in a way that was most favorable to the industry, with little regard to what's right for the resource. The lobster fishery is a classic example of how not to do something, and the lobster fishery should remain closed under the National Marine Sanctuary Act or the refuge, whichever it ultimately ends up being, because lobsters are a very difficult resource to model. They're also a very easy resource to knock down population numbers. So when Westpac steps forward and says what a great job we've done of managing the lobster fishery in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, just remember, it was a federal judge that said, no, you didn't, based upon the way that you managed it and based upon the assumptions that you used in your model. And it's a classic example of how the lobster fishery improperly influenced the management process.
They need the option, when you have a place like the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, of being able to set it aside and not manage on the basis of multiple use, which is the basis on which most other national marine sanctuaries in the United States is managed.
This is an incredible natural resource. As a surfer, I came to recognize that the great blessings of Hawaii are oftentimes our natural environment, and we have to do everything we can to preserve and protect it and nurture it. And for those reasons, I'm supporting any conservation efforts to protect the Northwest Islands from commercialization or inundation by population or fishing or any other thing that may threaten that resource.
Commercial activity is not confined just to fishing. As we all know, there are other ways that you can put a resource as special as this to commercial use. While ecotourism sounds like a good thing, too many users, it doesn't matter how good their intentions, can impact an area. Even scuba divers, a flip of their flipper can destroy coral formations, delicate coral formations that may have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to grow because of the slow growth rate in this colder water. The Northwestern Islands is also home to the only known population of Hawaiian monk seals. That population right now is about 1,300 individuals and declining. Monk seals as a species are sensitive to human impact. It's important that all commercial use be banned from the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands to protect this area.
We really need to take great care in what we do up there and how it's managed in the future. There are several threats that are much larger than the Hawaiian Archipelago or the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And those are things like global climate change, which has led to a number of bleaching events that we've seen in recent years in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And in addition to that, marine debris, mainly from fishing gear from the North Pacific, but also plastics that are found around the world. Those things are going to take much more national and international cooperation to be able to address those issues because they're global in scope.
One of the sad things I did observe, though, was the albatross chicks, which had been fed piles of plastic by their parents because the plastic looked like their normal prey. Just seeing them decomposing because they stopped eating because their stomachs were full, but full of stuff that they couldn't digest. And so just to see a decomposing juvenile albatross with a pile of plastic lighters, Bic lighters, straws, any kind of plastic that was small enough for them to pick up. To compound the sadness that I experienced in looking at that deceased baby albatross was the fact that there were thousands of them all over the place that were in that state of decomposition. So the resource is being significantly impacted by the simple fact that somebody on land threw a Bic lighter away, which found its way into the ocean, which found its way into the beak of mother or father albatross, and then eventually down the throat, and resulting in the death of a baby albatross. But it also proved to me that we have to be very, very careful with what we do on land, because anything that is thrown away on land and makes its way into a stream and then makes its way into the coastal waters and then eventually offshore poses a threat to marine life, whether they be birds, whether they be turtles, whether they be monk seals. There is no such thing as separation of impacts. What we do on land impacts the ocean, and the sight of those baby albatrosses full of plastic, dead, disintegrating, was the call home to that message. We as human beings need to learn to be more responsible for what we do. That's the key.
I think there's a lot of things we can do and have been doing, and I'm really pleased to see that our Department of Land and Natural Resources seems to be really supporting marine protected areas. I was with an Earthwatch organization in the Philippines, and people in those very poor areas had begun setting aside areas where they were not fishing, and they were not allowing anyone else to come in and fish. They had guard shacks on the beach where the men sat there and watched their marine sanctuary. And they learned very quickly that in just a few years, the fish populations grew. And not only grew in the protected areas, but there's something called the spillover effect, that some of the eggs were recruited to areas outside, or fish just moved out of the areas and were available to fishermen. It's been tried all over the world. We know that Hanauma Bay on Oahu has more fish in that little bay than are probably around the entire island. And it's the only place you can go and occasionally see a shark or see big jacks. So we know that protected areas work, and everybody wants fish, more fish. The snorkeler, the dive operator, the environmentalist. But I don't begrudge the fish to the person who is feeding his family or wants to make a living fishing. But we have to recognize that we need to do something drastic or we're just not going to have fish at all for anyone. And it seems to me that setting aside certain areas of your coast as no-take zone is just going to help the populations elsewhere where people can go fishing. It's a real good example on the Big Island on the Kona coast. They set aside 35% of the area. It wasn't a complete no-take zone. It was to protect areas from overfishing by aquarium collection. And in those areas that are protected, the fish increased by something like 47% in 4 or 5 years. But the interesting thing is, in the non-protected areas where they continued to allow aquarium collecting, the people were collecting more fish too and making more money. So everyone seemed to benefit from the protected areas. And I think it's something I just really feel so strongly that we need to provide that kind of protection, or our children and our grandchildren won't see any fish at all.
In order to understand how these systems work, we really need the Northwest Hawaiian Islands as a living laboratory for understanding ecological processes, but also as a management benchmark, how we should manage our resources and what our goals should be for trying to rebuild and reestablish more pristine ecosystems in the main Hawaiian Islands and elsewhere around the world.
It's very important. I have found out from the collections that I have received, and there are over 1,000 collections that I have, it's very important that we get there to make a baseline study of the marine algae of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. We have found many new species there, and if I tell this to flowering plant people, they say, "Oh, you're just a splitter," because that's all that's left in flowering plants. You just don't have new species begging to be described, whereas almost everything you pick up in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, especially from deep water, is going to be a new species. I brought some specimens today, and most of them, maybe 99% of them, are going to be new species. This is Papahānaumokuākea, named after Bob Moffett, chief scientist of the SETI. This is Papahānaumokuākea christeri, named after the commanding officer of the Hi'ialakai, which I named along with Senator Inouye 2 years ago. It means embracing the pathways of the sea. In terms of invasive species, some of the worst invasive species we have are aliens. They were introduced here for industrial purposes and then abandoned because in one case, Hypnium muciformis, which came from Florida and planted in Kaneohe Bay, they were going to extract a colloid from it. Well, in about 2 months, it was over at Kualoa, and next thing you knew, it was at Ka'ava and Laie, and by the time I went home, at the end of 4 months, it was over by the Waianae side. So it's hair-like, and it has very fancy ways of reproduction. So it's a winner as far as being a settler. It's a winner. You can hardly beat it. And I am the person who found it in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands and just sick about it because I'll tell you about its life history. First of all, these thin branches that it produces, if any of those branches are broken, each one of them can make a new plant. Second, it has hooks at the ends of its major branches, which can hook onto other algae, can hook onto its own branches, can easily settle on anything and grow. And third, it has a sexual cycle. So it can make babies in the usual way of spores and a lot of little plants being liberated at the same time. So you think of it yourself. How can you handle this plant? You can't, well, it turns out that you have to get out in the field and pick up every last one. And I also felt I could shut up and not say anything, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't make an announcement that this terrible pest is now up in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. So I got the oceanographers worrying about this. One of them said to me, "Good for you, you found biological evidence of currents or eddies coming from the south up into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands instead of from the east or the north into the Northwest Hawaiian Islands." But that kind of answer wasn't, satisfactory to me. All I knew is that no ship took it there. And all I know now is that because the plants are so fine and have lost most of their red color, that they are too far down deep. And they're just probably going back and forth there and being distributed that way. So it's the balance of nature that we're after that will keep things in some kind of order. It's very easy to upset the balance, though, when you're off in the North Pacific by yourselves, and the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are out there by themselves. There's no question about that.
I guess I think the most positive developments are our own DLNR, the state saying that they're going to protect the state waters in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. That's out to 3 miles in a refuge, which would be a no-take zone.
Many of you were at Washington Place when we premiered The Voyage to QA, and after the film they hosted a dinner for the 50 or so people who were there, and I believe at each table, Senator, there were 5 or 6 people, 5 people at each small little tables. And Senator Hemmings and I happened to be at the table with Mrs. Bush. After quite a while of being there and finished eating and we were just talking, Mrs. Bush said, "Oh, I'm going to go change places with the President." I think she said George, but I'm going to go change places, meaning so she could go talk at the other table and he could come talk at our table. And we glanced over, and the President was in a very animated conversation with Jean-Michel Cousteau. And in about 20 seconds, she came back. And she said, "He's not ready to change places yet." And he was really involved and interested in this issue. It was his exposure to the issues involved and to seeing it so dramatically in the film. So I think it was a great thing to be able to expose people who have never been here to what it is we're all talking about. Government wasn't necessarily seeing things the same way as the NGOs were, yet through a great process of sharing of information and education and being open-minded, you were able to show the people in government why this was so very important. And I think you also give a good lesson to the general public out there that when something is worth fighting for, it's worth fighting for. And that means it might not happen in a month or even 1 year. It might take many years. So I think the lesson you give to the public is government is big and it's slow sometimes to come around. But because it is big, it takes a big public effort. And I want to thank you for never giving up on this issue.
The Sierra Club has been working for decades with other conservation organizations such as KAHEA, the Hawaiian Environmental Alliance, and the Hawaii Audubon Society, as well as Native Hawaiian organizations to protect the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And their efforts paid off. Recently, the President designated the entire Northwestern Hawaiian Islands as a national monument, which is a significant move for the protection of those islands because it really prohibits a lot of the activities that many folks were concerned about, namely commercial fishing. We know that with this national monument, it was going to be afforded protection that it didn't have previously. We're still waiting to see what the end result is going to be with management, because it will be somewhat co-managed between Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA. So we'll see what the final rules regarding the monument, how they come out.
Well, a national monument is created by a presidential proclamation under the Antiquities Act, and a national marine sanctuary is created through a process that is set forth in the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, and the laws are somewhat different. And the national monument designation allows the president to have as much or as little protection as he or she wants, whereas the National Marine Sanctuary designation tends to incorporate more commercial operations, but the designations can create different kinds of areas that are either very conservative or not in conservation. The monument designation is important, and it was really necessitated by the fact that the sanctuary designation process had gotten bogged down in political wrangling over whether or not there was going to be commercial extractive uses in the sanctuary. Specifically, the commercial fishing industry under Westpac had been arguing for years and years that there should be commercial fishing indefinitely in the sanctuary, and it had delayed any designation of a sanctuary. The monument designation allowed the administration to cut through this, to ban commercial fishing after 5 years and get protections without having to go through this endless process of debate and redebate and renegotiation over commercial fishing.
The Sierra Club and other groups were actually quite surprised when the President designated the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands as a national monument. We didn't expect protection from, frankly, this administration to be going that far.
My feeling is that this designation as a national monument is a very good thing. I think it is about as protective as we could reasonably have hoped, and it's the one good thing this president has done for the environment.
Whether or not this means that he's going to do something about serious global issues like global climate change remains to be seen, but at least for the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, it has received protection beyond what many conservation groups were hoping for.
The most important thing about the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands is its remoteness, is its fragileness, its susceptibility to invasive species, its susceptibility to being overfished, the lobster fishery being one example. Its limited ability to renew itself. The monk seal situation with the recovery plan is a prime example. The cultural resources that are in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands need to receive the highest level of protection. We don't need people who aren't qualified, people who aren't responsible for those resources in and on those islands. The fact that juvenile albatrosses are dying by the thousands today, even with the level of protection, is an indication of how impacts thousands of miles away can impact this fragile, one-of-a-kind in the world ecosystem. So we need the best, most restrictive, most responsible management structure for this priceless, precious, important area.
Okay, here, let me just read it a couple of times, and when you hear it, you say, yeah, okay?
Who are these people? Okay, can we get on with the show? They protected the islands because of the abundance of fish species, like Nemo and others.
So there's your soundbite.
The current status of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands,
that is pristine, or as close to pristine as possible. I think it's really important that we do our utmost to conserve them.
Do you want me to look directly into the land? Where do you want me to look?
Are you kidding? Back there? Let me get into character.
Can we start over? Please cut.
I just love West Papua. Everything that they were dragged kicking and screaming to do, they're claiming we're so proactive. It's amazing how you morph.
Hello, I'm Fred Hemmings. Among other things, I'm a state senator. I once was a surfer. In fact, I often joke now that I was once a respectable surfer. Now they're calling me a politician.
The sheriff and other groups were frankly shocked that the president designated.
Okay, let me start this over again. It's hard to explain.
If you want to, go right ahead and write the president, because I've written the president and asked him to go ahead and support this as what could be a singular environmental accomplishment for the current administration in Washington.
It's too late in the day for me to do it.
Okay, come on. We have to edit all this. It's gonna take longer and longer. All right. Easy for you to say. Go nuts. Okay.
The Hoa Island formed 7 million years ago. I made a speculation. Okay. Already.